Eve sat behind a veil of imperial dignity, watching the arena turn into a stage where other people tried to write her story for her. The martial arts tournament's first day was never just about swordsmanship. It was a lottery of fates, who fought whom, who rose, who fell, and the Empire loved nothing more than watching knights gamble their lives for a spectacle that nobles could applaud safely from above. When the host announced that the draw results would appear on the magic screen, Eve felt the mood of the crowd swell like a tide. Knights stepped forward in groups, drawing numbered balls, and the audience reacted as if destiny itself were entertainment. And then Eve saw it. Michael, Sylvester, Elijah. 3 names that should not have been woven into a single knot, unless someone had tied them there on purpose. Elijah's voice carried up from the line, light and sharp. Is this a strange coincidence? This wasn't coincidence. It was a provocation dressed as tradition. The host, grinning as if he'd been handed a gift, made it worse by turning the lottery into a public interrogation. The moment the loudspeaker magic tool was shoved toward Michael, Eve felt the crowd's attention pivot, hungry and cruel. Michael hesitated, rare for him, and dangerous in a place that demanded performance as much as power. When he admitted, "I couldn't decide," the arena erupted with boos loud enough to bruise. Eve's restraint nearly cracked. She almost rose, almost showed too much, almost made the mistake of protecting him with the obviousness of affection. But she forced herself still. Then came Sylvester. He faced the imperial seating with polished composure and asked, without trembling, for something scandalous enough to make the crowd lose its mind. "Instead of dedicating the glory of winning to the 8th princess, I ask her to kiss me." The reaction was immediate, a roar like fire catching dry paper. Eve's stomach sank. She didn't need anyone to explain what it was. She could see it, rose in its hand moving behind the scene, using Sylvester as a banner she could wave in public. When Eve glanced sideways, Rosenit's smile was too smooth, too satisfied, pretty to everyone else, ugly to Eve, because it was power-wearing perfume. Eve wanted to say it. Stop. Don't use people like ornaments. But that would only feed the theater. Then Elijah stepped forward like a man who enjoyed lighting matches in crowded rooms. He turned the sacred wish tradition into a weapon, reciting the old story, how homunculus fought to win the right to serve an imperial master. Then he twisted it. He knelt, not to his princess, but toward Eve's position. "I will write my wish to the 7th princess." The arena fell into an unnatural silence, so complete it felt like the world had held its breath. "If I win," Elijah continued, "I ask that the 7th princess receive me as a direct knight." For a heartbeat, Eve understood the trap in full. If she refused, she would look like she spat on tradition in front of 100,000 eyes. If she accepted, she would be painted as a sister who coveted another's knight, stirring scandal like entertainment. This wasn't about Elijah's devotion. This was Bridget's handiwork, politics disguised as romance, cruelty disguised as ceremony. Eve kept her face calm because she had been trained for that. Inside, she sharpened into something colder. Before she could respond, Michael moved. He stepped into the arena with a calmness that cut through the noise like a blade. His voice carried clearly even without magic amplifying it. "This is a question not worthy of an answer, Your Majesty. After all, Sir Halten will never make a wish." He bowed, an abbreviated gesture, deliberately just enough to be correct and just disrespectful enough to place Elijah beneath him. Then Michael raised his eyes to Eve and spoke, steady as a vow. "I will surely give you victory and glory like the flowers of laurels." Eve felt the moment shift. Michael had dragged the trap away from her feet and made it a contest between knights instead of a public trial of a princess. And then, because Michael was Michael, because he was both her shield and her most dangerous weakness, he set fire to the entire arena. "I made a wish." The host, delighted, urged him on. Michael's purple gaze lifted toward Eve. Even at a distance, Eve felt it land on her like a hand. He spoke in a voice that didn't belong to an imperial spectacle. It belonged to her. "I will give you the glory of victory, so I dared ask. Let me kiss you." The stadium detonated into cheers. Eve's composure nearly shattered. Heat rushed to her face, too intimate and too immediate. Under the veil, she lifted her hand toward her mouth before remembering she couldn't hide there. She lowered it again, helplessly. "Michael, what are you doing?" was what her heart screamed. What she allowed herself to think instead was quieter, more dangerous. "He's willing to risk being laughed at just to protect me." Rosenit's voice cut in sharply beside her, jealous and bright. She interpreted everything like a dagger, turning Michael's initial hesitation into suspicion, turning Eve's silence into possession. Eve kept her gaze forward, refusing to feed Rosinette the satisfaction of a reaction. But the poison of the moment lingered. That evening, after ceremonies and opera and the long march of official obligations, Michael asked to walk with her. Eve agreed because refusing him felt worse than any scandal. They took a gondola across the lake garden, the water dyed gold by the setting sun. On the small pavilion island, the palace felt far away, as if the world had narrowed into just two people and the fragile truth between them. "You were bold today," Eve said at last. Michael looked almost guilty. He admitted he acted because Elijah had tested the position of her direct knight, because the situation had been dangerous. Eve tried to make it light. She told him the crowd didn't need a real kiss. "You don't have to do it." But Michael's expression tightened as she noted that their promise to kiss became invalid. It startled her. He wasn't angry in the loud way nobles became angry. His anger was quieter, almost wounded. "If you don't want to, you don't have to do it," he said, "but for it to just not happen just makes it invalid." Only later did Eve realize what he meant, that there was a difference between a kiss that didn't happen and a kiss that was declared meaningless. That he didn't want her to turn even the idea of him into something disposable. He demonstrated how he would have hidden it if it had been necessary, drawing his cloak around her like a wing, shielding her face with his hand in a way that would fool the world. Eve's breath hitched despite herself. For a moment, it felt too close to real. When they parted, Eve returned to her chambers with her heart loud in her chest and her thoughts in disarray. The tournament climbed toward its sharper rounds. Quarterfinals became semifinals, and the remaining nights were all direct nights, men whose victories could shape reputations, promotions, and their futures. Eve watched as Rosinette bragged about Bridget's daily desserts, brandishing them like proof of favor. Eve answered sweetly with words sharp enough to sting, a reminder that Bridget's kindness was not innocence. On the day of the semifinals, Eve's instincts tightened. Bridget was late. That absence didn't feel like an accident. Eve could almost hear the gears of the palace turning behind the delay. Then Michael fought Sylvester. Eve watched two blades speak a language older than politics. The duel wasn't a massacre. It was skill, trust, and rivalry braided together, until the decisive moment arrived. Sylvester's hair came loose in the shockwave, silver spilling like a banner. The crowd went wild, intoxicated by beauty even in violence. And Michael ended it. He turned defense into offense, shaping Aegis into a weapon, and when the dust settled, his blade held the truth at Sylvester's throat. Victory. The stadium erupted. The narrative machine of the Empire began to grind again, already hungry to turn their friendship into a play. Eve saw Michael support Sylvester out of the arena, steady and loyal even after striking him down, and something inside her softened with pride. And then the most anticipated battle of the day begun. The horn's echo still trembled in the air when steel met steel. From the first clash, the duel refused any pretense at caution. Michael's silver-gray blade met Elijah's golden sword again and again, sparks flashing like thrown stars. From Eve's seat, it looked almost beautiful until she remembered beauty could still be lethal. Elijah didn't fight like a knight. He fought like a knife in the dark. He slipped inside Michael's range, struck at blind angles, hunted the back of the head and the space beneath the ribs. Fast. Mean. Precise. He moved as if rules were something other people carried. Michael noted how unknightly he moved. No honor, just calculated slyness. The crowd laughed, thrilled by the bite in it. Elijah's smile sharpened, as if being called unknightly was the one insult he couldn't tolerate. The magic stones in his sword and dagger began to glow. A new pressure filled the air. His attacks flooded in, heavier now, faster, hitting like repeated thunder. The stadium shook with every collision as if the stone floor itself was protesting the violence. For a while, Michael gave nothing away. He avoided, blocked, redirected, tested. Then Michael saw it, something subtle, frightening. His sword weakened. Not in strength, but in presence. Like the edge was losing its certainty. His purple eyes narrowed, the first crack of surprise. "You're stealing my mana," he said, voice flat with disbelief. "A magic stone that drains it?" Elijah answered too easily, too happily, because he had been waiting for that moment. "It interferes with conversion. Different from a drain, but the same result." His eyes gleamed. "The more we clash, the more you'll run dry. Let's see your limit today." So that was it. A trap disguised as bravery. Force Michael into constant contact. Force him to defend. force his mana to leak away in front of the whole empire. Elijah surged again, eager now, like he could already taste victory. I look forward to it, Michaelis Agnito with no mana. Michael's answer was cold enough to frost the air. I'll kill you before I run out. It sounded like arrogance. It was resolve, the kind that doesn't bargain. Michael shifted tactics. He stopped treating Elijah like an opponent meant to be outlasted, and started treating him like a problem meant to be ended. He used the scabbard like a weapon, ramming it into Elijah's flank, a blunt, humiliating hit that finally broke the perfect rhythm. Elijah staggered, furious. The announcer called it a valid hit, as if the whole battle hadn't been lethal from the start. Michael pressed in. He began timing contacts, dagger first, then Elijah's sword, testing, measuring. The dagger strengthens you, he deduced. To drain me you need contact, so you block with weapons that shouldn't be able to block. Elijah grinned like he'd been praised. Smart. But knowing doesn't help, Elijah added sweetly. Does it? Elijah stabbed in hard, aiming for Michael's arm. He expected blade against blade, but Michael caught Elijah's sword in its sheath. A terrible, clean sound rang out as metal locked against metal. Elijah's eyes widened. Michael didn't hesitate. I got it. He struck the hilt, and the magic stone shattered. Fragments flew like broken teeth. The crowd roared as if they'd witnessed a miracle. Elijah's face flushed with rage, but his eyes flicked to Night Ray, flickering darkly now. You don't have much mana left, Elijah realized, triumphant again. Do you? Michael admitted it with a calm that felt like a knife. No, I don't. Elijah laughed loud, wild. Then this is the end. He charged straight in, intending to crush Michael with raw force. Michael raised Aegis. Quartz-like barrier bloomed, blue and crystalline. Elijah slammed into it again and again, grinding strength into the defense until the ground itself cratered beneath them. The crowd began to boo. They wanted fireworks, not endurance. They wanted romance and blood, not a wall. Elijah used the moment. He urged Michael to do what he'd done before, to coat the barrier in sword energy and explode it outward. Come on, Elijah shouted. Show them something before you lose. Michael understood then. Elijah wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to make him empty himself. Trying to make the king bleed in public. Michael sighed, like a man deciding something unpleasant. Fine. He poured the last of his mana into Aegis. The barrier turned into a blade. The explosion hit the stadium like a storm breaking. Dust swallowed the arena. The crowd screamed in delight. Elijah landed cleanly, already grinning. Good. Now lose properly. Then the dust thinned. Michael stood in the crater, brushing back his bangs. And sunlight fell, clear, cruel, on hair that had turned a vivid, unmistakable pink. The stadium went mad. Pink. Flower pink night. Eve's stomach dropped at the same time the crowd cheered, because Michael's expression wasn't joy. It was cold fury. He moved like someone who didn't care about mana anymore. He appeared in front of Elijah in an instant, faster than before, too fast for exhaustion. Elijah gulped. Michael grabbed his shoulder. And drained. The announcer shrieked about transformation. The crowd screamed because the pink was fading, but Michael barely heard them. Elijah wasn't resisting. He was letting it happen. Michael noticed too, shock flashing in his eyes. What craft is this? Why are you allowing the mana drain? Elijah's face twisted, his face transforming as if he'd finally found a precious lost object. It's you. He shouted, words breaking apart, and then he attacked like a madman. The duel restarted at a higher level, cleaner, sharper, deadlier. Elijah moved like a berserker without a stone. Michael moved like a king without restraint. He stopped wasting time and forced Elijah backward. He kicked him, brutally, shamelessly, straight in the stomach. The crowd gasped, then cheered, half relieved to see cruelty matched with cruelty. Elijah staggered up, furious. Michael waited just long enough for him to stand. Then he ran and leaped, used Elijah's sword like a step, vaulted over Elijah's back, landed behind him, and flicked Night Ray once. A thin line opened across Elijah's neck. Not enough to kill. Enough to end. Elijah dropped both weapons. Silence snapped through the arena. Then the verdict crashed down. Michaelis Agnito, victory. The audience erupted. The announcer crowed about the flower pink night, about romance and climax, about the kiss Eve would surely grant. But Eve's eyes were only on Michael as he turned away. He walked into the dark hallway with his back to the cheers like someone leaving a battlefield he'd survived by instinct alone. Something in him had shifted. as if the fight with Elijah hadn't only decided a winner, but had cracked open the door to everything that came after. The roar of the stadium followed Michael only a few steps into the corridor before it thinned into something distant and hollow. Victory tasted like iron. He walked with rigid composure, night ray already sheathed, expression smooth and untouched. Only when the shadows swallowed him did the strain surface. His steps faltered. The third awakening did not rise gently. Heat flooded through him, not just at his core but through veins, lungs, fingertips. His breathing shortened. The stone floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. He steadied himself against the wall. Not now. He had endured Elijah's mana draining stone. The forced detonation. Aegis overuse. Mana drain. And then, the world spun violently. He forced himself upright. The awards ceremony was not finished. He would not collapse before 100,000 spectators. He would not stain Eve's name with weakness. He took a step forward, and a voice halted him. Michaelis Agneto. His jaw tightened before he turned. Elijah stood at the far end of the hallway. The manic grin from the arena was gone. His golden eyes were sharp now, searching, uncertain. Michael straightened fully, masking everything. If you lost, admit it cleanly. But Elijah did not rise to the bait. You don't remember me? The question cut through the dim corridor with surgical precision. Michael stilled. So he had noticed. He had remembered. A flash of the past life flickered: battlefields, rebellion, a young knight spared at the edge of annihilation. What will change if I remember? Michael answered at last, voice flat. Lately, I regret that I saved your life. It was confirmation enough. Elijah's eyes widened, not with anger, but with something closer to relief. Michael moved to pass him. He had neither strength nor patience for this. Go your way, he said coldly. And stop flirting with my princess. It was meant as warning. Behind him, Elijah laughed, but not the wild, unhinged laughter from the arena. This was softer. Disbelieving. Almost grateful. He followed. Michael lengthened his stride. Elijah kept pace. Have I annoyed you? Michael did not slow. You know, I won't do it again. Let's get along. Don't ask for what you cannot have. They moved like mismatched shadows through the narrow corridor, one rigid, the other orbiting too close. Where are you going so fast? Elijah called lightly. Let's go together. Michael's tone sharpened. Do you want to die, Sir Halston? The formal address made Elijah flinch. He corrected instantly. Brother. Michael stopped so abruptly the air seemed to snap between them. What? Elijah smiled, almost boyish. I'll call you that from now on. Michael looked at him as if evaluating a new species of madness. I have no brother. Let's leave the past behind, Elijah pressed. I'll even write a pledge. The heat in Michael's body climbed higher, vision threatening to blur at the edges. He had spared Elijah once. Perhaps that had been mercy wasted. Then Elijah's tone shifted. I'm going to do well now, okay? Trust me once. I'll do whatever you tell me. Michael's gaze sharpened. Then kneel. Elijah dropped without hesitation. Not reluctantly. Not sarcastically. Deliberately. Michael stared down at him, Elijah Halston, proud and ruthless, kneeling in a dark corridor like a loyal hound awaiting command. Absurd. And yet, earnest. Elijah was still kneeling, not trapped, not coerced. Choosing to remain there. The golden eyes that had hunted him in the arena now held something steadier. You are not my brother, Michael said. I know. You are not my subordinate. I know. You are an inconvenience. Elijah smiled faintly. Even so. Michael looked at him a moment longer, then gave a quiet command. Get up. Elijah rose at once. Keep your distance from my princess, Michael said. Do not make me regret sparing you. Yes. And stop calling me that. A hint of mischief returned to Elijah's eyes. No. For a brief, dangerous second, Michael considered drawing his sword. Instead, he turned away. Elijah followed, but this time half a step behind. Not chasing. Not competing. Matching pace. Something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer merely rivals forged in one tournament. They were men bound by a secret neither would speak aloud. After the awards ceremony where the golden laurel wreath was bestowed upon Eve, Michael collapsed once again in the dark corridor. The strain hit like delayed pain. It began as heat, familiar enough to be named awakening, unfamiliar enough to feel wrong. The first and second times had burned cleanly in one place, like a brand pressed to the heart. This time the fire spread everywhere at once. It climbed his veins. It tightened his lungs. It prickled in his fingertips like the air itself had teeth. His breath shortened. He reached for the wall, palm against stone, as he slid to the floor. Elijah's mana had flowed too easily. Not ripped away. Given. That agreement, the silent consent in Elijah's body, was the last shove. It tipped Michael over an edge he hadn't realized he was standing on. The corridor tilted. The world blurred at the edges, and the third awakening did what it always did when it grew violent. It opened a door inside his skull and dragged him through. A red light swallowed his vision. It wasn't the stadium anymore. It wasn't the corridor. It was a room that felt like a cage. The air was too still, too heavy, like even dust was afraid to move. A porcelain bottle rolled across the floor, small, harmless-looking, obscene in its simplicity. And there, on the couch, was Eve. Not standing. Not speaking. Not breathing. Michael's chest locked. For a sick heartbeat, he couldn't understand what he was seeing, his mind refusing the shape of the scene, refusing to translate it into truth. Then the meaning struck, sharp as a blade driven under the ribs. Poison. Belladonna. The memory didn't offer mercy. It didn't soften the edges. It made him watch it whole, Eve's body, the silence around her, the way the world continued without her as if her absence was acceptable. His throat seized. A sound tried to climb out of him and failed. And then the vision turned, showing him what came after. Michael in that life, hollow-eyed, filthy with grief, held Eve close. A red obelisk. A room lined with complex arrays and soft, web-like threads across floor and wall and ceiling. The spruce sage standing over the ruin of everything, an owl mask hiding a face that would not flinch. A ritual. Regression. The word landed like a verdict. The red mineral structure in the center of the room, no, not an obelisk. A philosopher's stone, sacrificed down to half its existence. Time itself being bled. Because someone couldn't endure the loss of a loved one. The someone was not a mystery for long. The memory forced him to feel it from the inside, his own arms around Eve's unmoving body, his own refusal to let go, his own desperation sharpening into something beyond reason. He had rebelled. He had taken a throne. He had thrown away his body and mind to keep the empire standing. And then he had thrown the empire away too. For her. The red light grew brighter, ravenous, eating sound first and then sense. It drowned the world the way deep water drowns fire. His consciousness began to fray. His memories began to slip like sand through fingers. And somewhere in that collapsing reality, Michael did the one thing he could still do. He held her tighter. He tried to speak. Only a few words survived the flood, thin, desperate, almost childish in their honesty. I loved you. The rest was swallowed. The light took everything. And then, Michael's eyes snapped open in the corridor. Stone wall under his hand. Cold air. Dim lantern light. The distant echo of celebration like something happening in another universe. His breathing steadied as if a switch had been flipped. The heat that had been tearing through him receded, leaving his skin damp, his limbs heavy, his heart pounding with an aftershock that felt like grief disguised as life. He stared into the dark as if it might answer him. The riddle he had circled for so long, the strange coincidences, the familiar dread, the way Eve always moved like someone trying to outrun fate, finally settled into place with brutal clarity. The one who had dragged the world back. It wasn't an abstract miracle. It wasn't the sage's whim. It was Eve. The name rose out of him like a prayer and a wound. Eve. He said it without intending to, softly, as if speaking louder might break the fragile fact of her existence in this life. Behind him, the stadium still roared. Ahead of him, duty still waited. But for a moment, Michael stood completely still in the hallway's shadow, staring at nothing, knowing everything. He had been given a second world. When the ceremony concluded and he vanished from sight, Eve noticed. She did not wait for explanations. She summoned Amber and followed the golden morpho butterfly back toward the arena. Through dispersing crowds, through fading noise, up toward the roofline where the world grew quiet. She found him seated along the slanted roof, staring at the summer sky as if it might answer him. Michael, why are you here? He turned slowly. His voice was lower than usual. Slightly rough. Princess. There was something distant in his eyes, something that did not belong to this day. Eve approached him quickly, worry plain on her face. Did something happen? Were you injured? He shook his head. If I stayed here, he said quietly, I thought the princess would come find me. It was not strategy. It was confession disguised as simplicity. She frowned. You could have told me. I wanted to see you alone. The words were unadorned. No metaphor. No knightly polish. Just truth. The wind moved gently across the rooftop. His gaze did not waver from her face. It was not possessive. Not fevered. It was longing. As if he had lost her once. As if he had already mourned her. Eve shifted under the weight of it. You're acting strangely today. I am. A faint smile curved his lips. Perhaps I am tired. She studied him more carefully. His composure was intact, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it, a steadiness that felt newly forged. He spoke again, softer. Princess, thank you for choosing me. This time, when he lifted her hand, the kiss lingered, not dramatic, not public. Just deliberate. He had once turned back the world for her. Now, in this life, he would do something far more difficult. He would win her heart without destroying everything else. The awakening had given him memory. Memory had given him certainty. He had once begged in a dying world, "Love me a little." In this life, he would not beg. He would earn it. The inauguration ceremony unfolded beneath the heavy summer sun, 200 homunculi standing in rigid formation, like a silent army awaiting judgment. From beneath the royal canopy, Eve watched carefully. This was more than ceremony, it was a public declaration of power. Names were called in order. Emblems were pinned. Sylvestian received his command. Elijah followed, accepting his unit with a grin that suggested he welcomed whatever meaning the Empire layered onto his title. Then Michael's name was announced. He stepped forward without arrogance, posture straight, expression calm. Desmond II's voice carried clearly across the grounds as he granted him command of the Imperial First Knights Templar. The Punitive Knights. A subtle ripple moved through the royal family. The name was sharp, almost provocative. Punishment implied judgment. It implied a target. Michael accepted the emblem without reaction and descended the podium. As he walked past the assembled homunculi to claim his unit, their bodies betrayed them, shoulders stiffening, necks pulling back, instincts responding to something they did not consciously understand. Eve noticed. So did Rosnet. When Eve glanced sideways, she found Rosnet staring at Michael without blinking, ruby eyes fixed on him with open possession. It was originally my knight, Rosnet murmured. Eve's voice remained composed. What logic leads you to that? The best gifts from the Imperial Palace have always been mine. Eve smiled faintly. You're mistaken about one thing. Michael will never imprint on you. No matter what you sacrifice. The words struck cleanly. Rosnet's expression tightened, beauty turning brittle. Eve softened her tone only slightly. It doesn't matter. You were the Empire's white rose even without a direct knight. For a moment Rosnet wavered, then recovered, sharp and defensive. You're telling me not to take interest in Sir Agnito. Eve did not deny it. Because she was. When the appointed knights returned to their royals, Michael approached Eve. He addressed her softly, took her hand, and kissed her fingertips one by one, an intimate gesture far too deliberate for a public space. Eve startled, until she saw Rosnet's frozen stare. Then she understood. This was not carelessness. It was a message. Michael was drawing a line without speaking. Eve rose, still holding his hand. Let's go. Together they left the ceremony behind, while Rosnet remained standing, watching what she could not claim. The garden they chose was a shade tunnel in the central grounds, an archway thick with vines, red rose petals scattered across the path like velvet spilled from a noble sleeve. It was quiet enough to breathe in, private enough to speak without being overheard. Eve finally looked at him properly there. The emblem on his chest caught light every time he moved. Commander. First. Punitive Knights. She offered what was expected, but her voice carried real approval. Congratulations, Captain Michaelis. Michael answered like a textbook knight. It is thanks to the grace of the princess. I will lead well and make your loyal knight shine. Eve smiled. She meant it when she said, the knight I need is only Michael. He tilted his head slightly, that subtle predatory intelligence flickering behind polite eyes. I guess so. If you have me, you will also have my knights. The words were structured like loyalty. But the meaning underneath was different. Eve felt a small chill of uncertainty, like she'd stepped onto a floor that looked solid but might be glass. Before she could chase the thought, Michael changed direction smoothly, as if he'd planned the turn. I overheard your words with the 8th princess. Eve's chest tightened. She'd tried to keep Rosnet's obsession contained, but Michael had noticed anyway. Of course he had. It was nothing important. Michael didn't accept that. It seems that a story has come and gone that isn't good for me to hear. Eve sighed in spite of herself. Anyway, you're quick. His reply came with an almost playful edge, but Eve could tell it wasn't play. If the princess likes a bear-like knight, I will try to change. Eve, honest and slightly flustered, answered the truth she believed would be safest. No, I should accept Michael as he is. Michael's eyes widened for a heartbeat, then he smiled, and the smile was charming enough to make Eve's thoughts stutter. Then, like this. He leaned in just enough that Eve's breath caught. Michael. He didn't touch her. He didn't cross the line. He only hovered at it, letting Eve feel the danger of how close he could be if he wanted. And then, as if nothing had happened, he asked the question he'd been circling like a blade finding the throat. So, did the 8th princess covet me? The word covet hit Eve like an insult. It made Rosnit's obsession sound uglier than interest, more invasive than admiration. It made it sound like theft. And for the first time, Eve felt a new emotion rise, sharp and unfamiliar. A dislike of having to think about Rosnit while she was with Michael. A refusal to talk about her sister's greed when Michael was standing right there, looking at Eve as if her answer mattered more than the empire. Eve hesitated, then realized what Michael actually wanted. Not gossip. Proof. Of course, I believe my princess handled her well, he said, and his tone was calm, deceptively mild. What did you warn the 8th princess about? Eve chose her words carefully. That Michael would only be imprinted on by me. Michael's reaction wasn't the satisfaction Eve expected. It was heavier. Almost electric. The imprint isn't the only thing between us? Eve blinked. Huh. Even after removing the engraving, I have sincerity towards the princess. Sincerity. The word made Eve's face warm. It sounded like confession dressed in formal clothing. Michael pressed his hand against his chest, as if restraining something alive there. It seems my heart does not reach the princess at all. Eve stared at him, mind racing, cheeks hot with confusion. His metaphors were too dense, his gaze too direct. It felt like he was watching for every flicker of her expression, as if one wrong reaction would give him away. Eve panicked, not outwardly, but inside, and tried to rescue the moment with something sensible. You're not supposed to use that orthodox language. Michael's gaze dropped suddenly, as if he'd been struck. Not by words. By restraint. Like he'd wanted to say something else, something more dangerous, and had forced it back down. Before Eve could fix it, the end of the shade tunnel appeared, and with it, the first raindrops. Oh, Eve said softly. It's raining. The rain turned quick, summer-heavy, drumming through leaves. Eve lifted her hand to form a barrier. Michael caught her wrist gently and lowered it. Please rest comfortably, princess. Then he drew his sword and spread Aegis above them like a crystal umbrella, the barrier shimmering overhead. Eve stared, half amused, half exasperated. You're using Aegis for something like this? It is to protect my princess from the rain, he said as if it were the most reasonable statement in the world. It is an honorable use. Eve laughed despite herself. The mana consumption would be huge. The mana of a homunculus is vast, he replied smoothly. Rest assured. Eve wanted to argue. But there was something tender in how effortlessly he placed her comfort above his own resources, so she let it go. And the barrier, mixed with the rain, turned the world into a small private dome, Eve and Michael alone, the outside blurred into silver sheets of water. Michael looked at her as if this was what he'd wanted all along. Isn't it frustrating, he asked, meaning the barrier, the closed-in space. Eve surprised herself by answering honestly. It's kind of charming. What about Michael? Michael paused for a beat that felt like he was choosing which truth he was allowed to say. I wouldn't mind if time stopped like this, he said. Because I am with the princess. Eve smiled, then immediately felt her heart twist, because she didn't know what to do with words like that. They weren't inappropriate. They weren't explicit. They were worse. They were sincere. And Eve, who was used to dealing with threats she could name, couldn't decide whether Michael was flirting, confessing, or simply reaching for her in a way he didn't yet know how to control. When the rain began to fade and the light returned, Michael held out his arm. Princess, your hand. The ground was wet, slippery with mud. Eve rested her hand on his forearm and let him guide her, steady as a rail. And as they walked beneath a broad sycamore, rainwater that had pooled above finally dumped. Michael moved without thinking. He pulled Eve into his chest and took the water on himself. Eve looked up at him, stunned, his bangs dripping, black eyelashes heavy with water, the line of his jaw wet and shining. She scolded him, worried, frowning. Michael only said, as long as the princess didn't get wet, that's enough. Eve wiped his face with her handkerchief, then, when the cloth soaked through, used her gloved hand without realizing it. Her fingers brushed his cheek. Her thumb wiped water from near his eyes. Michael froze like a man struck silent. His eyes fluttered wildly, breath catching. Princess, wait. Eve realized too late what she'd done, gloved hand to skin, intimate in a way she hadn't intended. She apologized in a rush, embarrassed, face burning. Michael, equally flushed, hid his mouth behind the back of his hand, pretending to be composed. They walked awkwardly, the air thick with everything they hadn't said. And Eve, because she was still a princess even when flustered, made the most practical decision possible. The separate palace is near. Come to my place to wash and change. Michael nodded, and his agreement felt too quick, as if he'd already been praying for an excuse to follow her home without asking. The garden walk ended that way, not with a confession, not with an argument. With rainwater, trembling hands, and a path that kept narrowing towards something neither of them could pretend was nothing. Steam clung to the marble columns and curled lazily toward the domed ceiling of the bathhouse. Michael remained submerged to the waist, the surface of the water trembling faintly with each breath he drew. He had meant to seduce her. Instead, he had fallen deeper. The memory of Eve's gentle hand against his cheek replayed with merciless clarity, the warmth seeping through her gloved hand against his skin, the slow sweep of her thumb beneath his eye. Even now, simply recalling it made his thoughts drift. This is driving me crazy, he muttered to himself bitterly. He had tried to orchestrate every gesture in the garden, measured words, calculated charm, the careful distance of a night pressing just close enough to tempt. Yet in the end, it had been Eve who unsettled him without effort. His head tilted back against the cool stone. Eve. The name slipped from him before he could restrain it. He stilled. Calling her so freely was not something he had ever allowed himself. He had been taught, ingrained into obedience, that using a nickname without permission was a declaration of desire. A step toward a bed he had no right to approach. Yet tonight, restraint felt thin. Because she was not merely his princess. She was the axis of regression. Fragments of memory pressed into him again, the strange conversation from earlier, her words that had sounded almost too knowing. Isn't it true that after ending the relationship with that homunculus, you accepted me as a direct knight? Yes. He died. He pressed a hand over his eyes. Dead. The one she'd killed in her mind was the him from another life. In that other life, there had been no uncertainty. I'm going crazy. This life's Michael had been pure, ignorant of the past, sincere in his loyalty. He had believed himself righteous, even scolding his former self in ignorance, condemning the audacity of a knight who dared show desire to a princess. He had criticized himself without knowing. A humorless breath escaped him. Why? He submerged his face in the bathwater, holding it there until his lungs burned, until the world blurred and silence swallowed everything. When he rose again, water streamed down his face, but it did nothing to cool the heat in his thoughts. If he could return once more, he would go back to that moment and silence himself. Elsewhere in the palace, Eve was not reminiscing about their first life. She sat in her office, sleeves neat, posture straight, listening to Sadila's report with focused intensity. The prototype stamina potion was nearly complete. When will it be stabilized? By the end of the summer rainy season. Too late. It must be ready before the masquerade. Her tone was firm, decisive. The midsummer masked ball would precede the monsoon, a final indulgence before a week of relentless rain. It was the perfect stage to introduce a stamina potion under the guise of luxury. She understood the appetite of nobles well. Tell Ramon to prioritize commercialization. Yes, my lady. Report followed report, construction progress, weapon orders, whispers of Bridget seeking funds through low-ranking but wealthy nobles. They are trying to raise funds to run the Imperial Guard as they please. Sadila's expression hardened. It must be stopped. Eve lowered her gaze thoughtfully. Not necessarily. If Bridget bore the cost of systematizing and training the reorganized knights, the structure would already be in place. And Michael could harvest it later. Let's stop it in moderation, Eve said mildly. Sadila nodded, reassured despite not fully understanding. Eve continued working long after dusk. Amber eyes skimmed documents at relentless speed. She ate finger food without lifting her focus from the parchment. An information network in Haidlun. Funding channels. Serenita reports. Albin's oversight. Control, always control. She trusted, but she never relinquished the reins. In separate chambers of the same palace, two minds burned in different ways. One drowned in memories of a ruined world. The other quietly built the next one. Dusk had already approached before Eve noticed. The office was only lit by the magic lamp Peony had turned on early, and Eve's concentration had run so deep she'd mistaken exhaustion for normal. Peony brought her a drink, and Eve only realized what it was after the first few gulps, the bright, familiar color of Ramon Javiel's fatigue recovery drug. Peony's intention wasn't subtle. Eve needed stamina for the night. That reminder dragged Eve back to reality. Today was an overtime day, and she couldn't afford to give the palace any excuse to bite at her. Did I make other mistakes? The question circled him mercilessly as he sat patiently in Eve's bedroom. Memory surfaced unbidden, mocking the one who had performed the regression ritual, calling him incompetent, calling him a bastard who had to turn back time to appreciate what he'd lost. He had said those words, and the sage had heard them. But had Eve? How much had the sage told her? How far had he explained the ritual, the sacrifice, the unbearable loss that drove a king to destroy and rebuild the world? Michael pressed his hand against his forehead with a dull thud. If Eve remembered up to the moment of her death, then she would have sought answers. She would have gone to the sage. Would the sage have told her everything? That someone had overturned the empire for her. That someone had slaughtered, rebelled, imprisoned. That someone had loved her enough to reset existence itself. The thought made his pulse stagger. When he exhaled, breath ragged, the conclusion was cold and clear. He would say nothing. Not until Eve spoke first. Strategically, it was correct. Revealing fragmented memories would gain him nothing. His past life was a ledger heavy with sin, rebellion, purges, confinement. Only one thing could counterbalance that weight. He had loved her. Enough to burn the world. But even that memory had been stained. Eve had once described that former Michael as ferocious, reckless in desire. What must she think of him? He had rebelled. He had ruled through blood. He had imprisoned her. He had seduced for politics. He had let rumors of children twist into weapons. And the baby. His breath caught. In that life, Rosenet had poisoned Eve. But before that, had she flaunted a child? Had she claimed something in her womb was Michael's? Where had Eve learned that a homunculus and human could conceive? The answer was obvious. Rosenet. Which meant Eve may have believed that what Rosenet carried was Michael's child. The thought hollowed him out. Even if it had been duty. Even if it had been strategy. From Eve's eyes, what would it have looked like? A knight who seduced one princess for power, another for advantage. A man without integrity. I'm going crazy, he laughed weakly. Would she ever love him, knowing that version of him? He was not that man. This Michael wanted only to give. To protect. To kneel if she asked. Why must he inherit the sins of someone who shared his face? Yet the memories were his. The love was his. The desperation was his. And he could not sever himself from it. Eventually, exhaustion dulled the spiral. His thoughts drifted toward Rosenet again, toward Eve's guarded behavior in this life. Had Eve guessed the motive behind her poisoning? Had she pieced together jealousy? If so, he was relieved. He would remain upright and unambiguous in this life, but it comforted him to know Eve might also guard herself. After bathing, Eve entered her bedroom and offered Michael an apology for her tardiness. He stepped forward in the dim light, dressed too casually, shirt half open, skin exposed enough to make Eve look away on instinct. Before she could settle, Michael told her there was a problem. The couch had been removed. Eve immediately understood what that meant. Peony had likely noticed the pattern too many mornings without proof the two of them shared a bed. Eve made a quick decision and told him they would sleep in her bed tonight. Michael hesitated, caught between chivalry and necessity, but Eve pulled him down beside her anyway, promising nothing would happen. The fatigue recovery drug kept her awake, so she tried to chat, asking what he'd done while waiting. Michael explained he'd been stuck in the bedroom since Baljamic hadn't brought him a uniform, and he'd spent the time reading tactics, preparing to lead his knights. Eve, warmed by the sight of him, spoke too honestly about how seeing his face made her feel fortunate. The sincerity left Michael silent, trying to read her emotions like a battlefield map. That pause tempted Eve into mischief. She leaned close, pointed out they were in bed, and teased that she only called him by his first name there. The joke didn't land the way she expected. Michael went still, then retaliated with quiet precision, whispering her name near her ear, repeating it until Eve flushed and startled, and then kissed her palm instead of her hand or fingers. The kiss was intimate enough to steal her breath, and Eve only then noticed the strain in Michael's other hand, clenched on the sheets as if he were restraining something sharper than desire. When he finally pulled back, he framed it as a lesson. Eve had provoked him first, and she wasn't as immune to payback as she'd thought. Trying to escape the awkward tension, Eve ended the moment and noted that teasing Michael on a bed was quite dangerous. She realized quickly what she'd let slip and gasped in surprise. She quickly insisted they sleep. Dawn came early. Eve woke to an empty bed and found Michael on the floor beside it, leaning against the bed with his eyes closed. He'd avoided sharing the bed after all. Watching him like that, Eve felt both exasperated and unsettled by how easily his defenseless beauty could shake her. She admitted to herself that she'd never been this easily stirred in her past life, and resolved, grimly, almost like training, to harden her heart. Not long after, the palace was hit with a new crisis: mana supply disruptions. Cold wind golems and cooling stones stopped working, turning midday in the imperial palace into misery. Eve listened to Sadila's report and immediately doubted the official explanation given to them. If the issue were only a supply route, the whole palace wouldn't be affected evenly. She suspected the real problem was at the center, the Philosopher's Stone. Michael, standing at her side, reached the same conclusion from the angle of what he remembered about the past. The Philosopher's Stone had once been sacrificed for regression, and it made sense that the damage would eventually surface. Eve calmly projected the consequences forward and saw opportunity in the pressure it would put on Desmond II and the research that might follow. It struck Eve that the Philosopher's Stone was used in the making of homunculi, so it was unlikely that the imperial family would give up on beings that formed the foundation of their power. Eve was sure they'd find a way to continue the creation of homunculi. Eve then asked about the Eastern Annex and learned that the older princesses had gathered at Bridget's residence. Eve understood it as a strategic migration, escaping the heat and clustering around power. Rather than leave that situation alone, she opened her own residence wide, letting the right targets come to her. Soon the youngest twins, Bianca and Aloysia, arrived with a fashionable strategy card game from the salons. Eve welcomed them, sat with them, and let Michael act as dealer. The twins played with eager competitiveness, ganging up on Eve and enjoying their winning streak, while Eve learned the rules quickly and endured the 2-against-1 imbalance with an amused calm. After several rounds, the twins suggested a bet, confidence blooming now that they felt victory was guaranteed. Their requested prize was shocking. They wanted Michael lent to them for a week. The room's warmth died instantly. Eve shut it down without softness, making it clear Michael was not an object to be gambled. The twins pushed back, parroting what they'd seen older royals do, and their insistence carried an uncomfortable resemblance to the possessive culture that had already ruined other members of the family. Eve redirected the bet with ruthless elegance. She refused to wager Michael, but offered something more politically meaningful. The winner could use the green room for 3 days. The twins lit up at the value of the residence itself. Then Eve demanded their stake in return. If Eve won, the twins would serve as her maids for a week. The condition shocked them into hesitating, but Eve's pleasant, carefully controlled smile left them no graceful exit. With the table set and the power balance quietly shifted, Eve told them to begin. What was meant to be a single deciding round did not end cleanly. The twins, flushed with pride and cornered by their own wager, refused to concede after the first loss. The match turned into a best-of-3. When that failed them, it stretched into a best-of-5. Each extension revealed the same truth more clearly. This was no longer a playful game between sisters. It was a lesson. Eve had learned the rules quickly. Too quickly. Once she understood the mechanics, she dismantled their combinations with quiet precision. The earlier laughter faded. The advantage of 2-against-1 meant nothing against experience sharpened by politics and survival. By the final round, the gap in skill was undeniable. The twins were no longer grinning. They were being played. When it ended decisively. Eve, the overwhelming victor, regarded the defeated pair with composed calm, neither cruel nor indulgent. The terms had been agreed upon. Pride had carried them here. Come to work at 6 a.m. tomorrow. The words were simple, delivered without raised voice or gloating triumph. The twins lowered their heads. Yes, Sister Eve. Eve prepared cold brew tea leaves as a gift and left for the main palace with Michael as her only escort, taking the garden shade paths to avoid the heat and eyes. Once the leaves enclosed them and the world softened into green hush, Michael spoke with dry humor, describing the betting match as a crisis he had barely survived. Eve responded lightly, admitting she had been provoked into refusing to lose. Michael admitted something more dangerous than humor. He had interfered in the first game, arranging favorable cards so the situation could be reversed later, except Eve had crushed the match too quickly for his manipulation to matter. He didn't present it as pride. He presented it as motive. He had no intention of being lent out, even for a week, even as a joke. His loyalty narrowed into a single point, and he asked to be judged for it. Eve didn't punish him. She accepted it as proof that he belonged to her, and she touched his hair with an ease that made him go still in that quiet, obedient way of his. Their walk should have continued, until the shade broke and the garden's chatter thickened. A pavilion tea party appeared in their path, and at its center sat the fourth Empress Remil, elegant, silver-haired, and sharp in the way women become when they've survived court too long to fear anyone younger. Beside her sat the ninth Empress Ariadna, loyal to Remil to the point of self-erasure, and a new face, Baroness Camilla Ancha, a merchant-turned-noble whose title smelled of fresh money. Eve read the arrangement instantly. Remil's tone was velvet, but the purpose was hard social positioning, finance, and marriage wrapped as harmless conversation. Eve greeted properly, sat briefly, observed the players, and noted Remil's faint displeasure when Eve took interest in the Baroness. It was the same old game, sell alliances as if they were favors. Eve left the table quickly, polite and cold. Once they were alone again, Michael saw her tightened expression and jumped to the wrong conclusion when she mentioned marriage. His reaction was immediate and violent in its restraint. He panicked like the word itself was a blade aimed at Eve. He blurted it out in a hurry, "But you haven't had your premarital education yet." Eve jumped back, scandalized at the mere mention of it, and she quickly corrected him. It wasn't her marriage. It was Euclid's. Michael's composure returned in an instant, as if nothing mattered once Eve was safe from that particular threat. Before Eve could explain further, Michael silenced her and pointed out movement. Someone was hiding near a broken section of hedge. Under invisibility, they found Euclid honey blonde, crouched and trembling like a child who had been cornered by adults' decisions. Eve understood what had happened without being told. Remil's tea party had been close. Euclid had been close. The boy had heard enough to break. Eve changed her plan on the spot. She abandoned the visit to the Emperor and approached Euclid gently, acting as if she'd simply stumbled upon him. He flinched, eyes wet, trying to pretend he wasn't crying. Eve offered sorbet and cool air back at her quarters, small kindness first, then control. When he hesitated, she gave a simple command in a tone that left no room for refusal. Euclid followed, especially once Michael's presence pressed down like a quiet threat. Back in the green room, the doors closed and the staff withdrew. Euclid sat across from Eve in a parlor too beautiful for his mood, waiting for punishment. Instead, Eve gave him truth. She explained the guards' reorganization, the way money was required to turn a display of homunculi into a functioning core, and the way Bridget and Remil would seek funds. Then she said what he had feared without softening it. He was being used as the token in a political alliance. Euclid cracked. Under Eve's questions, he admitted his mother had warned him the night before. And when Eve asked if he had told Ariadna his opinion, Euclid's grief burst into real sound. He confessed through sobs that his mother had belittled him, reducing him to a face that could be sold for a high price. Eve's sympathy was immediate and sharp. She let the boy cry, but she did not let him stay helpless. She asked him whether he would allow his life to be sold, then offered a deal. It was not comfort. It was purchase. She promised protection from the arranged marriage, not only today, but going forward. She promised him a path to learn swordsmanship properly, away from his mother's control. When she demanded what he could give in return, she guided him to think in future terms. Euclid, desperate for an identity that wasn't sellable face, threw out the only thing that felt solid. He would become her knight. Eve accepted immediately, because it was the answer she wanted. Then the room snapped into motion. Eve called the staff in and issued orders like a general. Scholarship placement for Gnosis Academy, preparations for gifts, messages to the third Empress Villanelli, and even a command to force social training onto Euclid through Hugh. Euclid bristled, but the argument had already ended. Eve's household moved as one body when she decided. Eve explained what the academy would mean. Distance from arranged marriage, distance from court pressure, a place where swordsmanship could be taken, if Euclid proved himself capable enough to qualify for the deeper trek. She did not make it sound easy. She made it sound inevitable, and then she made it sound expensive, reminding him she would receive his transcripts each term. Euclid didn't like it. He didn't refuse it, either. Eve left to put out the fire, taking Michael with her to Villanelli, because Villanelli was the one Empress positioned to block Remil's authority over Euclid's marriage. Villanelli's residence was cool, built for gardening, protected from the manna shortage that was roasting everyone else. Inside the greenhouse garden, Villanelli greeted Eve with a smile that didn't hide the fact that she already understood Eve had come to ask for something. Eve stated it plainly, she had come for Euclid's life. Villanelli questioned Eve's closeness to Euclid, and Eve answered with politics. If Euclid opposed Remil and Eve opposed Bridget, their interests naturally aligned. Villanelli approved. She agreed Euclid was too young to be sold off, and the academy was a clean refuge, 5 years of protection, long enough for the board to change. Then Eve revealed the deeper hook. This wasn't only about saving a boy. Remil's marriage scheme would create new funding lines for Bridget. Bridget wanted money to shape the Guard into private force. Villanelli, an enemy of Remil, had no reason to allow that. Villanelli argued that blocking one marriage would only delay the inevitable. Eve agreed, then shifted the battlefield. The point wasn't to stop Bridget forever. The point was to squeeze. The point was to force the third princess into desperation, expose the black money chain, and keep Bridget bleeding legitimacy while she scrambled. Villanelli caught on quickly and named it for what it was, illegal funds. Eve confirmed it. Chansley's financial power didn't make sense. The penalty deadlines and the immediate need for enlistment funds created pressure. Under pressure, people reached for convenient crimes. Eve asked Villanelli for a light hand, just enough to save Euclid and to justify the Empress's intervention. Villanelli accepted. She promised good news soon, and almost unexpectedly invited Eve to visit more often, suggesting companionship beneath the polite words. Eve agreed smoothly, took the favor, and left with Michael. For days after Eve secured Villanelli's cooperation, the matter erupted. Evidence surfaced that the ninth Empress, Ariadne, had verbally abused Euclid and neglected him for years. What had been a private wound became a public scandal. The imperial palace buzzed with outrage. Some even demanded that Ariadne be stripped of her maternal authority. The issue escalated beyond petty rivalry. It now touched on the formal rights of an empress. Desmond II had no choice but to intervene personally, and he was visibly displeased at being dragged into a domestic disgrace. Eve visited him under the pretext of a respectful greeting and offered a solution already prepared. She cited precedent and recommended Euclid's admission to the academy, framed not as exile, but as refinement. A clean resolution. Desmond approved, relieved to resolve scandal without blood. Eve left satisfied. Now the future depended on Euclid's effort. She did not intend to merely rescue him. She intended to raise him properly. If a homunculus could not climb beyond certain ranks, then perhaps a human knight could. Commander of the Imperial Guard was the highest realistic summit. It was a distant ambition, but distance did not discourage Eve. She returned to the green room, where summer light filtered through leaves and her household felt almost peaceful. On either side of her, the twin princesses busied themselves with teapots, cheeks flushed with concentration. They had grown attached, almost embarrassingly so. What began as strategic education had become something softer. They brewed experimental blends and waited for her approval like apprentices seeking praise. Eve corrected gently, refined their technique, and watched their attitudes change in real time. They no longer treated her as rival. They treated her as a center. She did not hate their clinginess. It was useful and it was warm. That warmth fractured when Peony screamed outside the door. Michael was already standing by the time the door opened. Bridget entered alone. Her presence was a cold wind in midsummer, floral perfume, and sharpened fury. Eve did not rise in alarm. She sipped her tea. Everyone was dismissed. Even Michael. Bridget remained standing. She did not intend civility. "You are interfering with everything." Eve answered mildly, "There seems to be a misunderstanding." What a shame. The anger in Bridget's face betrayed more than pride. Euclid's exposure had hurt her politically. The damage was larger than expected. After a pause, Bridget asked quietly, "What kind of whim has overtaken you?" Eve did not answer with strategy. She answered with reflection. She had once died regretting her inaction. Now she would not. "I am only fulfilling responsibilities I once neglected." Bridget warned her. Regret. Consequence. Futility. Eve rose then, meeting her sister eye to eye. "If my greatest regret in life is opposing you, then I will have lived well." Bridget's smile sharpened. They parted with threats disguised as predictions. When the door shut, Sedila approached, concerned. Eve brushed it aside with dry humor. Seeing Bridget shaken energized her. Summer moved forward. The heat grew oppressive. The Philosopher's Stone could not remain frozen forever. Desmond resumed mana supply in part, stabilizing some palace functions, but without cooling magic stones, the Imperial Palace still sweltered. Eve trained each morning despite the weather. Her stamina improved. Work resumed immediately after training. Reports piled up. Among them came Alban Redman, dramatic as ever, complaining that the protocol department was melting and drowning in accusations over heatwave supply distribution. Eve soothed him and, with deliberate showmanship, promised him a public reward, magic stones and cooling support framed as bounty. The real purpose was morale, optics, and loyalty. Alban then delivered what mattered: suspicious activity around Count Gigolo and Countess Nivelle, linked to Chansley. Their so-called night salon gatherings, masked social salons, might be distributing illegal stimulant substances. Eve connected the pattern. Chansley's finances did not add up. Pressure from fines, reorganization costs, and Bridget's ambitions created incentive for hidden revenue. She gave the order: investigate whether illicit aphrodisiacs were being circulated. The timing was perfect. The Imperial Masquerade, a midsummer's daydream, approached. It was the Empire's most decadent social event. Information flowed freely where faces were hidden. Alban warned her about another risk: herself. She was a prime target. Vulture's noble young men would be emboldened by anonymity. Confessions, seductions, calculated scandals. Michael would not be allowed to attend. Invitations were restricted. Homunculi were not recognized as full social participants. That absence weighed on him more than he admitted. At Colosso Arena, the air always smelled faintly of metal and dust, training sand baked by summer heat, then dampened again by spells that never quite masked how hard the Empire was forcing its new core to become real. Michael stood outside the ring, arms folded, watching his punitive knights collide with a mithril training golem like scattered pebbles thrown at a wall. They were strong. Too strong individually. That was the problem. For homunculi rushed in with the same instinct, to crush it, end it, and prove themselves, each one trying to be the blade that mattered. They chased openings that didn't exist, swung at angles that interfered with one another, and retreated only when their own breath demanded it. No one covered. No one anchored. No one thought of the next 10 seconds as a shared future. The golem didn't even need to be clever. It simply rotated and endured, absorbing strikes with a body that did not flinch and returning force in wide, indiscriminate sweeps. Every time the homunculi scattered, the ring looked less like a unit and more like a crowded hallway during a fire. Michael's jaw tightened at a familiar frustration. A kingdom could be built on monsters, but a battlefield could not. Behind him, soft footsteps approached, unhurried, familiar, careful in a way that suggested the owner of them didn't want to startle something dangerous. Sylvester Millard stopped beside him, gaze settling on the ring with the same quiet disappointment Michael felt. Even from the corner of his eye, Michael could tell Sylvester had already watched his own knights fail in the same way. It showed in the set of his mouth, in the way his shoulders rested, as if he'd already accepted this would take months instead of days. Sylvester's voice was mild, but it carried the weight of reluctant honesty. He admitted the punitive knights looked no different from the White Knight. Michael didn't argue. There was no pride to protect here, only a future that would eat them alive if they pretended. It was strange, watching Sylvester speak like this. Sylvester had always been good at being bright, at being the kind of friend who made dread feel distant. But today the reality pressed too close: demon dragons in the frontier, a core being thrown together out of pride and politics, and knights who'd never been taught that the battlefield didn't care who shone brightest. Michael asked a question that slipped out before he could soften it, a question that sounded casual, but wasn't. What would it feel like, fighting together? Sylvester answered with that same unearned confidence homunculi were born with, and for a moment Michael almost smiled. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was memory. It was hours of sparring, shared rhythm, the kind of familiarity that let two fighters move as if they'd rehearsed a war. Michael found himself thinking of the sage again, of that half-explained bond spoken of like a prophecy. He didn't have time to chase it. Because the training ground gained a new sound, footsteps that didn't bother to be quiet, and a voice that arrived like a hand thrown over someone's shoulder without permission. Elijah Hall's 10. He strolled into their space, as if the world had been waiting for him, lemon eyes bright, smile too easy for a man who had tried to bleed Michael dry in front of 100,000 people. Elijah's presence always did the same thing: it infected the air with a casualness that felt offensive in a place built on discipline. He called Michael brother again. Michael's expression didn't change, but inside him something tired and sharp twisted at once. I should never have saved you. Sylvester, ever polite, looked at Elijah like he was trying to solve a puzzle that kept laughing at him. Sylvester murmured that the transformation didn't suit Elijah. This wild friendliness pasted over someone who clearly enjoyed cruelty. Michael, without looking away from the ring, agreed in the driest way possible. Elijah ignored them with practiced ease and leaned forward, finally noticing the fight ahead. His evaluation was immediate and merciless. He called it a fraternity, like they were boys playing war with sticks. Michael's discomfort rose, not because Elijah was wrong, but because Elijah had the nerve to be right while standing there like a pest. Michael asked why Elijah was even here. If Bridget's side noticed, it would invite suspicion. Elijah's face shifted at once, sliding into something pitiful, soft around the edges, an expression designed to pull at instincts. He implied he'd become a discarded card. No longer valuable. No longer protected. It was a performance. But it was a good one. Sylvester's gaze clouded. He offered help before he even knew he was offering it. White Knight could take Elijah in, he suggested, if Elijah feared being cast aside. Michael watched Sylvester fall for it with a quiet, simmering disbelief. Elijah mumbled about punishment, about consequences, about how he'd deserve it, his eyes averted, voice careful, posture small. Sylvester's sympathy deepened. Michael's patience frayed. It wasn't just annoyance. It was the old knowledge of politics. If Elijah was discarded, it was because someone wanted him loose. Or because Elijah had made himself loose on purpose. Michael spoke about the rainy season, about a week of joy. He noted casually of the masquerade 3 days after the rain. The den. The anonymous ballroom where Eve would be surrounded by predators wrapped in perfume and poetry, and where Michael, until now, had believed he could not follow. Even thinking about it made his stomach tighten, not with jealousy alone, but with the protective instinct that had become his entire reason for existing in this life. He didn't speak it aloud. He couldn't. He only stood there, watching his knights fail to coordinate, watching Sylvester accept comfort from Elijah, watching the Empire shuffle toward disaster with borrowed discipline. And then the Emperor's man found them. Count Isidore, soft-faced and brown-haired, approached with the quiet authority of someone who could summon death with a polite tone. He led them aside, away from ears, and presented black invitations like sealed curses. The 3 knights knelt. Michael took the invitation with steady hands. He read. He didn't react, not visibly. But something in him went very still, like a blade being slid from its sheath in the dark. Attendance wasn't an honor. It was an order. And as Sylvester and Elijah traded unease and gallows humor, Michael folded the invitation against his chest, gaze fixed on nothing in particular, as if he'd already stepped out of the training grounds and into the masquerade's shadow. Inside his head, only one thought remained clear enough to shape itself into a vow. I will be there. Michael arrived at Eve's residence, and noted how busy everyone appeared. Peony caught Michael at the threshold, and asked him to move a box of vials to Eve's bedroom. He then needed to arrange them on an empty shelf. The bedroom was quieter than the rest of the green room, thick curtains drawn against the worst of the heat, the faint scent of soap and parchment lingering in the air. It was one of the few spaces in the palace that belonged entirely to Eve. Not to a title. Not to a strategy. To her. Michael stood near the side table, finishing the careful arrangement of Ramon's stamina potions. 30 slim glass bottles, their strange pink liquid catching the light like captured sunset. He handled them with precise attention, though his thoughts were nowhere near the task. The powder room door opened. Eve stepped in, her hair loosened from fittings. A faint flush still clung to her cheeks. Michael. He turned too quickly, as if caught doing something suspicious instead of something mundane. It's just that Lady Graniche asked me for a favor, so I came in for a moment, he said, unnecessarily defensive. Eve accepted the explanation without suspicion. Everyone must be busy. The rainy season preparations are worse than a military campaign. Are they all leaving for the rainy season? He asked, placing the final bottle into the cabinet. Yes. Peony, Rihanna, Hugh, and Sedila too. She spoke lightly, as if it were natural. She has her own estate to manage now. And you? His voice was calm, but something beneath it tightened. You will stay alone? Eve tilted her head. Not alone. There will be rotating staff outside the residence. And you? He didn't let himself react outwardly to that single word. I will take care of you, he said quietly. During the rains. She moved toward the seating area, stretching her somewhat stiff shoulders. The sound of fabric brushing against itself filled the room as she walked, a soft counterpoint to Michael's heartbeat, which had not quite steadied since the training grounds. A faint smile touched her mouth. Then we'll start with teaching you how to brew tea properly. So they did. He brewed Earl Grey rooibos stronger than necessary, perhaps to give his hands something to focus on. They sat facing each other in the softened light, the bed behind them untouched, the air thick with unspoken things neither quite named. The masquerade, he began carefully. Are preparations going well? Eve groaned softly, leaning back against the couch. Don't remind me. 3 nights. 3 dresses. Masks to match. Accessories that change every day. You'll surely look beautiful, he said. The young lords who dance with you will be fortunate. She studied him for a moment. It would be better if you were there. The words were simple, honest, unadorned. He deflected, lightly, teasing her about lowering her barriers to entry, about how she would surely enjoy herself. She narrowed her eyes at him. Why are you pushing me toward other people? He looked away under the guise of adjusting her teacup. Because if I don't joke, I'll say something dangerous. Instead, he let a different irritation surface. When she mentioned gifting Alban a custom chair fitted with a warming magic stone, his tone shifted. A thermal magic stone? She blinked. Yes, it's hot. An insulated chair that cools the body. I thought I was the only one who received the princess's warmth. The remark was half serious, half playful, but the jealousy beneath it was real. It startled her. It's not warm, it's cold magic, Michael. In winter, he continued stubbornly, a soft chair with warmth in the back and armrests. It's like sitting in your lap and being held in your arms. Her face flushed instantly. You're exaggerating. Am I? He pressed further, emboldened by the faint pink climbing her ears. And what of the 8th prince, he added, voice deceptively mild. You said he would become your knight. You said it proudly. In front of me. She froze. That was political. You also once said you didn't need other knights. There it was, the accumulation of small grievances, spoken not with anger, but with a fragile honesty that made them sharper. Aren't you being rather cruel to me, princess? He asked softly. Eve looked genuinely distressed. He almost regretted it. Then she stood. He expected a retort. A clever deflection. What he did not expect was the feeling of her presence behind him, close enough that he could sense the faint warmth of her skin. Before he could turn, her arms slipped around his neck from behind. Not tight. Not practiced. Awkward, almost careful, as if she were afraid he might break. Her cheek hovered near his temple, her breath brushed his ear. Do you feel better now? For a moment, his mind emptied. The contact was light, but it struck deeper than any blade. His entire body went rigid, as though stillness were the only way to survive it. He could feel where her forearms rested against his chest, the subtle pressure of her fingers where they clasped uncertainly. He had imagined many things. He had not imagined this. I do, he managed at last, voice low and strained. Thank goodness, she said, misunderstanding the reason entirely. Her arms slipped away. The absence was immediate and cruel. He wanted to turn. To say something. To reclaim even a fraction of what had just happened. Instead, he stood. I should go, he said. Rest well, princess. See you tomorrow, Michael, Eve said warmly from her seat. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Silence swallowed the room. Eve remained still for a heartbeat longer, then smacked her head on the table with a dull thud. What did I just do? Her face burned hotter than the summer outside. She pressed the back of her hand against her lips, as though trying to cool them. It had been impulsive. Reckless. Not strategic. Not measured. She leaned against her arms and whispered his name into the empty air. Michael. The sound felt different when no one was there to hear it. Outside, the palace continued its restless preparations for the masquerade. Inside, something far more dangerous had already begun.